1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Welcome to NHL Quick Hits. I'm David Crosby here with Steele Roden, and we're going to switch gears a little bit today. The Montreal Canadiens are the newly crowned Kings of the North after sweeping the Winnipeg Jets in round 2. I hope you listened to our series preview and hopped on what Steele was betting on in this one, because that would have been a really nice payout. Montreal is Canada's last remaining hope for a Stanley Cup championship this season, and of course, they are the most recent Canadian franchise to win it all the way back in 1993. And just a little bit of salt in the wounds of Toronto Maple Leafs fans this evening. They had to see the CN Tower lit up in Montreal Canadiens colors. So go figure, who would have ever thought the Canadiens colors would be flying here in downtown Toronto? But of course, Montreal flipped the switch, down 3-1 to the Leafs in round 1. And they've been amazing ever since then. They haven't trailed in nearly 438 consecutive minutes. That's the second best mark in league playoff history, behind only the Montreal Canadiens 1960s team. Now, of course, teams get hot. Montreal is on fire right now, but I think this is a wake-up call for the rest of Canada's Cup hopefuls. We'll get to the non-playoff teams in another episode, but today Steele and I are going to look at what's next for Canada's 3 eliminated playoff teams and what they need to do to make the necessary improvements to get to how far the Canadiens have gone so far. Now let's start with the Jets. They looked completely shell-shocked after losing Mark Scheifele to suspension for his hit at the end of Game 1. Winnipeg, they have an elite goalie, a deep core of talented forwards with a mix of veteran and young talent, and one of the most inexpensive groups of defensemen in the entire league, but they might get more expensive in a hurry. Neil Pionk and Logan Stanley are RFAs, Jordy Ben, Derek Forbert, and Tucker Poolman all UFAs. On offense, all their core players are locked in, but depth guys like Paul Stastny and Matthew Perreault are UFAs as well. So they have just 15 players signed for next season, Steele. Do you see a big makeover coming in Winnipeg, or are there more subtle changes they can make to take that next step forward?
I think it's more subtle changes moving forward. I think, it's exactly the same kind of situation with the Maple Leafs. They had a really great depth chart. They were strong up front. They got better defensively as the Maple Leafs did this year. And they had a really great goaltender in Connor Hellebuyck, one of the top 3 goaltenders in my opinion. And the same with the Maple Leafs, obviously balancing between the two of Jack Campbell and Frederick Anderson. But I think there's going to be some subtle changes. And I think the only reason for that is if they don't lose Mark Scheifele, they have a really good shot at beating the Montreal Canadiens. Even though I picked the Montreal Canadiens in 6 games, they still had a shot. But once Mark Scheifele was suspended, it was about over for them. And it really did just hurt the team. And then even in that second round series, guys like Nikolai Ehlers, Andrew Copp, Pierre-Luc Dubois, guys like that, they weren't really stepping up to fill that gap that Mark Scheifele left them in. So I think it's going to be more subtle changes. They had a really great depth chart. And like we talked about, guys like Kyle Connor, Nikolai Ehlers, Blake Wheeler, just a spectacular regular season as well as a first round series against the Edmonton Oilers. So I think it's going to be subtle changes. I think the big question is what they're going to do moving forward with Pierre-Luc Dubois, because honestly, he's been pretty abysmal and, kind of like a ghost out there since he's been acquired there. Only 20 points in 40 games in the regular season and 3 assists, no goals in the postseason. So he's got 1 year left on the contract at $5 million. It's going to be really interesting to see whether they keep him or try to move him and try to get something big in return on the back end. So I think for the Winnipeg Jets, they have what they really want right now, and it's just going to be a couple of subtle changes.
I think Pierre-Luc Dubois is really the most interesting part of what they're going to do forward, because he's about to get expensive after his contract expires at the end of next season. And like you mentioned, this team completely fell apart without Scheifele. And while I like their core players, I think they really need to acquire some talent on that back end that can spark some scoring outside of that top 6. And Blake Wheeler's prime, it's going to end soon. He's not going to maintain this elite level of play forever. I think I'd like to see the Jets push some chips in next season and maybe spend a bit more money on that back end. Let some of the younger guys hopefully handle 3rd and 4th line minutes on offense quickly before we move on. Do you see them giving Neil Pionk a long-term contract as a top 2 type of defenseman, or would you prefer them look around the league somewhere else?
I think Neil Pionk is the guy for the Winnipeg Jets. He's been absolutely spectacular for them since he's joined the team a couple of years ago. A couple of 40-plus point seasons, and he's been a really great defender for them and one of their best defenders, if not the best. So I think, like you said, they got to add some depth a little bit on the back end, but you got to keep a guy like Neil Pionk. He's been absolutely terrific for them all season long, as well as on the power play. He really does generate some offense for the Winnipeg Jets.
All right, so we both agree the Jets aren't super far away from contention. They can make some subtle little tweaks. But what about the team that got swept by the team that got swept? Of course, we're talking about the Edmonton Oilers. Now, they have 2 of the best players in the world in Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. They got a huge breakout season from Darnell Nurse, who was absolutely amazing in the playoffs, probably arguably the best player on Edmonton in that 4-game sweep. They currently have 17 players signed for just under $56 million next season, but they have some major decisions to make. Oilers GM Ken Holland has already confirmed he's interested in re-signing 39-year-old goalie Mike Smith for next season. I can see you cringing over there, Steele. Of course, Mikko Koskinen is there for one more season, and key players including Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Adam Larson, Tyson Barrie, and Dmitry Kulikov are all UFAs. So this is a seriously important offseason for Edmonton, and it could really shape the next 3 to 5 years of what this team looks like. Do you think they should look to re-sign some of those key UFAs I mentioned, or look outside the organization through trades or free agency and maybe spend some of that money somewhere else?
They have to look out to free agency and some trades. You just said it. They have no depth whatsoever in their lineup. In the regular season, Darnell Nurse and Tyson Barrie were top 4 for points for the Edmonton Oilers. And that's saying a lot when you have a guy like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins as well, who is a couple of points behind them. But when you have Tyson Barrie and Darnell Nurse as your fourth in the top 4 scorers, some things need to be changed. I think, like you said, I'm cringing with Ken Holland saying that he wants to re-sign Mike Smith. I'm okay with that as long as he takes a backup position. I really believe that they need to get a true number 1 starting goaltender, and Mike Smith is not that. I have absolute zero faith in Mike Smith to steal a playoff series or to play his best. And we saw that in the first round. He had a couple games where he played all right. He wasn't great. He wasn't terrible. He was mediocre. But, in that first game, you had guys like Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. The whole entire team actually weren't producing when Mike Smith was on his game. And then you had the other games where Mike Smith wasn't on his game. And then you had guys like Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl leading the way for the Edmonton Oilers and actually started scoring some goals and setting up some plays. So I think they really need to attack the offseason and get some free agents and make some trades here. They have absolutely zero depth, and that's really what hurt them in that first round against the Winnipeg Jets. You had no one else to depend on except for Leon Draisaitl and McDavid to make those plays, and it's really hard to do that in the postseason. We've talked about it, the momentum, the attitude, the way you play the game in the postseason is just so much different from the regular season. And as talented, as special as McDavid and Draisaitl you can't depend on them the entire series. I really did believe that they were great enough or good enough to carry the Oilers in that first round, but they're not, and they need some help in the depth charts there. And it's just they need to really work at acquiring some talented guys for the bottom 6 that can really play the game and help guys like McDavid and Draisaitl.
It's really shocking to look at the Oilers cap sheet coming up next year, and the same thing with the Maple Leafs, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes, and see how many players that played really heavy minutes for this team are free agents. And you come to realize that this could be a completely different team next season if that's the way they decide to go. Now, I'd hate to let Ryan Nugent-Hopkins go for nothing. I think he's a really underrated player and probably someone I'd want to hang on to, honestly, unless the price tag gets a little bit too high. But just with the way the league is financially right now, I could maybe see the Oilers getting him for a relatively good price, considering they drafted him. He's been there so long. I think he would want to stay and at least see them win. And same deal for Adam Larson. I know he wasn't drafted there, of course, but that big trade to bring him into town, he doesn't look great on the stat sheet but that could keep his price tag down as well. And I'd be looking to extend him too if I was Edmonton. Everybody else, I think I'd be willing to let them go as well. This team is a mess on the blue line and in net, frankly. I mean, Mike Smith isn't the answer. I've said all season I like Mike Smith. I think he had a great year, but he's a 1B. He is not a number one goaltender that if you consider yourself one of the elite teams in the entire league, you go in and know that he's going to play and get you 16 wins in the playoffs. He's just not that guy. So, that really creates a tough situation for them, having to pay Mikko Koskinen. I think it's $4.5 million still next season. So I'd like to see them maybe give up some draft capital to get a team like maybe Seattle to take Mikko Koskinen and just pay to get him off the cap sheet so they can have two good goaltenders there. I think they really need that. I'd also be interested in them maybe finding that number one goalie in free agency. Many of these guys are going to get re-signed, but Frederik Andersen, Tuukka Rask, David Dubnyk, Philip Grubauer, Peter Mrazek, they're all hitting free agency. Somewhere in there, I feel like the Oilers, if they can sign one of those guys, would significantly improve there on offense. And I want to touch on the defense a little bit before we move on to the Leafs. I think it also really hurt that they lost Oscar Klefbom. They have no idea if he's ever even going to play for this team again after that injury that he suffered. I felt like he was on the verge of a real breakout, and it really hurts Edmonton that he might never contribute there in a meaningful way. Do you see somebody that they could maybe bring in there, or even just a type of player that they can look to? Because I think Tyson Barrie, that experiment did go over well, but I'm not sure he's the type of guy I'd want to re-sign long-term.
Yeah, it's definitely tough because they just have to fill so many gaps in their lineup. And, they were really looking for Ethan Bear to step up a little bit, and he really didn't play his best in the postseason. Some very costly mistakes that cost them a couple of games there. But it's going to be tough because you have to fill so many gaps. Like I said, if I was a GM, I would be looking for another goalie, a true number one goalie. I would be looking to fill up the bottom six forwards before I even start touching the defenseman there, because I think if you really can round up the bottom six and get guys that can help McDavid and Draisaitl, and then just, those bottom six guys who can just find chemistry and work well together, can really help on the back end as well. So, like you said, it's a shame that Klefbom, it's, what his future might be with that Edmonton, even if he might play again. But guys like Darnell Nurse and Tyson Barrie, they really did step up this year. I think I would go back to Tyson Barrie to see if he can continue that and play the way he did when he was with the Colorado Avalanche. But for me, I would be looking to fill up the bottom six forwards and a true number one goaltender first. Those are the two primary problems for the Edmonton Oilers, considering that, you only got McDavid and Draisaitl really producing offensively.
Well, you know what time it is now, Steele. The Kings of the Collapse, the Heartbreakers, the always frustrating Toronto Maple Leafs. We mentioned Toronto blew that 3-1 series lead to Montreal after losing both John Tavares and Jake Muzzin to injury. Austin Matthews and especially Mitch Marner caught a lot of flack for their lack of production, and many people are begging for a trade of at least one of Toronto's pricey forwards. I'm going to put this bluntly, Steele. The Leafs cap sheet is a mess. Just looking at what they have coming up, I do not envy Kyle Dubas, because it is scary what they're going to have to do to fit enough talent under this cap. I mean, he made some magic happen this year, getting all those players to fit. And I don't want to say he got lucky with Frederik Andersen's injury, but it almost solved a problem for him, letting him bring in enough depth. And then the playoffs roll around, and it turns out they didn't even have enough depth after adding all those guys. I think no matter what, Toronto is probably going to be less deep next season, no matter what they do, than they were this year. They have just 15 players under contract for $68.5 million against the cap next year. Let me take a breath here before listing off the key players they have hitting unrestricted free agency. Trade acquisitions: Nick Foligno and Riley Nash, Zach Hyman, Joe Thornton, Jason Spezza, Alex Galchenyuk, Wayne Simmons, Frederik Andersen, and a handful of other depth players. So let's start with some of those guys, Steele. I would be begging on my knees for Jason Spezza to come back. Honestly, I think they're going to have to let the rest of them walk. Maybe Nick Foligno is willing to come back at, a short-term type of deal. He seemed to like it there. people are talking about $6 million for Zach Hyman. That's just not going to happen. There's no way they're going to be able to squeeze that number under the cap. You're Kyle Dubas. What do you do with these free agents?
He's in a tough position, and I just want to give credit to Kyle Dubas for what he did this season, acquiring the guys before the postseason as well as before the deadline. You know, you bring in guys like Joe Thornton, Wayne Simmons, you re-sign Jason Spezza, you bring in a guy like TJ Brody on the back, and you acquire Nick Foligno before the deadline. It really just gather a lot of leadership and veteran experience to this young offensive team that the Maple Leafs have. And that being said, those guys that Kyle Dubas acquired did absolutely nothing come postseason time. Like Joe, except for Jason Spezza, but Joe Thornton, Wayne Simmons, Nick Foligno, absolutely terrible out there. Did not produce whatsoever. And, you know, guys like Zach Hyman, even though he's a workhorse, he just does so much for the Maple Leafs, he didn't have the best postseason as well. And, you know, you're talking about $6 million for him. Two guys that I would be looking for, just trying my best to get a deal done, as Jason Spezza and Zach Hyman. It's going to be so tough to bring up a guy like Zach Hyman back because of the salary cap issues, paying those guys over $10 million, and then William Nylander $7 million. They're in a really tough situation here, but I would hate to see Zach Hyman go right here. He's just one of the best players on the Toronto Maple Leafs. You know, obviously not if you're comparing the skill-wise to Austin Matthews, John Tavares, Mitch Marner, and Nylander. He's not quite there, but he's just a workhorse. He does have great hands. He's incredible in front of the net for the Maple Leafs. I would hate to see him go. He's one of my favorite players to watch out there. But again, like the Edmonton Oilers, they're in a tough situation with the salary cap. You got to figure out what guys you're going to bring back and which guys you're going to let go. And then the question is, who are you going to trade and who you're not going to trade in those big four? I think we can both agree, right? I know I've said this a lot, but one of them has to go, and I think it has to be William Nylander. Obviously, with the discussions of Mitch Marner, with that debate going on about him, that he should be the one being traded, I think that's a ridiculous statement to put out there. He's just too special of a player, too talented for the Maple Leafs, and obviously we've seen the struggles in the postseason, but he's just too good to trade. I think a guy like William Nylander, you would get a lot of return. You would get a lot of return and fill those areas that you need help in, but I feel bad for Kyle Dubas. He did everything in his power to, you know, make this team a cup contending team. And those guys just didn't produce. Those talented guys up front, obviously it hurts with John Tavares and Jake Muzza being out. But with Austin Matthews, Marner not producing, and then those guys that you brought in doing absolutely nothing and not, you know, not finishing checks, just waving at the puck. It's just a tough to watch. So I'm really interested to see in what Kyle does this offseason and who he brings back, and I think one of them has to go. That's my thought on the situation.
I agree with you. I think we can all agree that Austin Matthews is going absolutely nowhere. John Tavares will be nearly impossible to trade. Even if you could get a trade partner for John Tavares, what you would get back would not even be close to worth it. Not to mention, he's your captain and he came home to play for you. They're not trading John Tavares. So I do think it comes down to Mitch Marner or William Nylander, unless you're going to just keep plugging on forward with those as your core four and filling in around them with cheap salaries, which, you know, up to this point, it just hasn't worked out well enough, unfortunately. And I think I would prefer to move William Nylander too. His cap hit is lower, so you're not getting that much more cap relief as you would moving Mitch Marner. But I think Nylander's price has probably never been higher than it is right now for how he performed in the playoffs. He runs so hot and cold, and he's such a frustrating player to watch, but he's also an amazingly talented player. And I think what he did in the playoffs will probably be at the forefront of many GMs' minds if they were looking to move him. And Mitch Marner, I feel like unless you're getting Jack Eichel, which Buffalo is not going to trade Jack Eichel in their division, if of course we get that same that realignment ends next season and we get the same division, that's just not going to happen. And then what? They would have Austin Matthews, Jack Eichel, and John Tavares centering three different lines. It just doesn't work out for the balance of that team. So I think that's a pipe dream for people who want to move Mitch Marner and they're talking about getting a guy like Jack Eichel. That's just not going to happen. I hate to break it to you, but you're going to get the raw end of that deal at the end of the day. So I think, like you said, Kyle Dubas does deserve a lot of credit for amassing the amount of talent that he has. he hit a home run with Jack Campbell, who I think a lot of people viewed as a throw-in in that Jake Muzzin deal. He mentioned him having some term left, and that really paid off for him. But Jack Campbell's going to want and deserve a big raise once his contract expires after next season. And I hate to say it, I don't even like bringing it up, but Morgan Riley, his contract also expires after next season. And I think those two guys are must-keeps for the Maple Leafs. I don't want to say no matter what it costs you, but without those two, man, the Leafs are in big-time trouble. So Kyle Dubas has a lot to work with this summer. It'll be interesting to see what direction the Maple Leafs go. Before we get out of here, Steele, anything to add on any of these three teams or even Montreal as they head forward here in the playoffs?
Montreal's been spectacular, and I want to get this out there. I actually called it from the before the season even started. I knew they were going to be the fourth team to make the playoffs behind the Edmonton Oilers. I did have the Vancouver Canucks finishing in second. I had the Winnipeg Jets not making it this season, but I was wrong on that. But I think everyone underrated and underestimated the Montreal Canadiens. But you can't underestimate a guy like Carey Price, bringing in guys like Toffoli and Josh Anderson, just big bodies who are fast and can skate and have a strong shot as well. And then finally, you get the guy like Cole Caulfield into the regular season at the end of the season, and you have all these things just working for you now. So I really did believe that Montreal was a better team than a lot of people gave credit for, and I'm looking forward to see who they play in the semifinals or the finals, whatever you want to call it. But I believe that they are, people are underrating them, and they have a really good shot scoring the Stanley Cup Finals against a team like whoever they play, either Vegas, Colorado, or Tampa Bay.
Well, whoever they face, they're definitely going to be huge betting underdogs, but they're also going to have a big rest advantage having swept the Winnipeg Jets. That's going to do it for today's episode. On behalf of Steele Roden, I'm David Crosby, and thanks for tuning in to NHL Quick Hits.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.